UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson did break the law when he suspended Parliament 5 weeks before Brexit. The country's Supreme Court handing down a ruling that could deal a hammer blow to Johnson's vow to oversee Brexit by the end of October. As the UN General Assembly kicks off in New York, Britain, France and Germany join the US in blaming Iran for an attack on Saudi oil installations, while urging Tehran to agree to new talks on its nuclear programs, Iran roundly rejecting that suggestion. And should single women and lesbian couples have the right to access state-funded fertility treatment? Lawmakers here in France begin debating a bill that conservative groups say will undermine the traditional family. Hello and welcome to the France 24 newsroom. It's good to have you with us. The UK's Supreme Court has just ruled that Prime Minister Boris Johnson acted unlawfully when he suspended Parliament for 5 weeks ahead of Brexit. It's a ruling that could have significant implications for the UK's departure from the EU. The UK Parliament could now be rapidly reassembled, with Johnson's authority considerably damaged just over a month before he vowed to oversee the UK's departure from the European Union with or without a deal. Let's take a listen now to that ruling from the Supreme Court.
The Court is bound to conclude, therefore, that the decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification.
Well, for more on this, let's cross now to London to speak with France 24's Bénédicte Paviot. Benedict, a truly unprecedented ruling coming out of the Supreme Court today.
Well, this is Judgment Day. It was always going to be a historic ruling about the relationship and the extent of the power of a British Prime Minister on Parliament. And it is indeed a very clear judgment from the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. And it is clear it was unlawful for the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks. Therefore, the conclusion is that Parliament was not prorogued and it can be recalled immediately. No action is required by the Prime Minister. That was indeed the judgment announced moments ago by the President of the Supreme Court. Unprecedented, historic, of huge significance and political consequence for the balance of power in this United Kingdom and for this Prime Minister, who only became Prime Minister at the end of July, succeeding Theresa May, who, having got a deal with the European Union, failed to get it through Parliament. So at this critical time in the constitutional political life of the United Kingdom, 37 days away from the 31st of October, that deadline given by the 27 other EU countries that the United Kingdom should leave with or without a deal. And a Prime Minister who said, do or die, we will leave. A Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who at this very moment is in New York. This is a hammer blow of huge proportions. Now, what is significant is that the Prime Minister himself, Boris Johnson, on his plane, on his way to New York, and then his Foreign Secretary on Sunday in a big political program here, Dominic Raab, have not, I repeat, have not ruled out proroguing Parliament. So we will see, of course, all eyes now on the government and its response, how quickly it comes and what that response is. Also, all eyes, meters from here, opposite the Supreme Court and this highest court in the land and this historic judgment, is Parliament itself. The lower chamber, the House of Commons, and the upper chamber, the House of Lords. And we will see how quickly they react. A huge day, a judgment day, in the United Kingdom for its balance of power and certainly for any Prime Minister and certainly this Prime Minister, Boris Johnson.
And the Speaker of the House of Parliament, John Bercow, just saying that the UK Parliament must reconvene without delay there. Bénédicte Paviot, thank you very much indeed. Bénédicte Paviot reporting from London. Well, for more on this story, I can bring in Philip Tell now from our International Affairs Desk. Philip, what's the reaction we've been seeing so far from the main political parties in the UK to that ruling from the UK Supreme Court?
Well, several have been speaking outside the Supreme Court building, waiting for this historic ruling to be announced this morning. Ian Blackford, the SNP leader of the House of Commons, has been calling for Boris Johnson to go, saying that this is one more step towards Britain not leaving the EU without a deal on the 31st of October, calling this a great day for democracy in the United Kingdom. His comments were backed by Anna Soubry, who's a former member of the Conservative Party who quit that party to go to the new Independent Party in the UK. She said that what was needed now was this next referendum in the UK to call for people to be given back the chance to vote again on whether or not they want to leave the EU with a deal, or whether they want to remain in the EU after the 31st of October. And Gina Miller, the campaigner and businesswoman who was one of those who'd launched a case against Boris Johnson, she just came out a short while ago to talk to the crowd, saying that this was a win for parliamentary sovereignty, and she underlined the words which were spoken by Lady Hale, saying that it was quite obvious that Boris Johnson had just been walking around with a blank piece of paper and that this prorogation was illegal.
And where exactly does this ruling leave Brexit, the million-dollar question?
Well, that's all been thrown up in the air again now. What we do know is that there's going to be a European Council meeting on the 17th and 18th of October. Now, up until now, it was up to Boris Johnson to go there to try to obtain a deal. He said he was getting towards a deal, making progress on it, and would come back probably with a deal which would be voted on by the House of Commons, and then Britain would leave on the 31st of October. With this decision to cancel the prorogation and the call for Parliament to resit almost immediately, it all depends on what happens to Boris Johnson between now and then. He's had a very rough time since he became Prime Minister, losing every single vote and losing this Supreme Court ruling today. So the pressure on him is going to be immense. And I'm not really sure where this is going to leave him with his ability to negotiate a deal with the EU and take Britain out of the EU on the 31st of October, do or die, as he's been saying.
And Boris Johnson's reputation very much damaged by this ruling.
Well, his reputation, if you look at it, he's been the Prime Minister who's lost the most in the shortest period of time, is in tatters. I think that he misjudged several things since he's been in office. He misjudged the ability of Parliament to fight back against him. He misjudged the ability of the courts to rule in favour of democracy. And it has been a bit of a disaster story for him since he first set foot in number 10 on the 24th of July. But if you look back at the Brexit process since the referendum in 2016, the Brexit process has put paid to David Cameron's being Prime Minister. It put paid to Theresa May being Prime Minister. She didn't manage to get her deal through. She tried 3 times and failed 3 times. And so far it's been a big failure for the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. So is he going to be the 3rd Prime Minister to fall as a result of the Brexit process? Well, I think time will pretty soon tell us.
And this was a unanimous decision by all 11 judges at the Supreme Court. A really unprecedented move from the Supreme Court against a sitting Prime Minister.
It is unprecedented because this is the first time the Supreme Court has intervened in parliamentary affairs, and this is something that has never happened before in peacetime politics, where there has been a court case against Parliament and the way it has been behaving and the Prime Minister. And the Supreme Court could have ruled that it wasn't apt to intervene in that because Parliament has sovereignty. The fact that it has intervened and said that the Prime Minister misled Parliament, lied to the Queen, and that his decision to prorogue Parliament was illegal, null and void is totally unprecedented in British democracy. And it goes to show that even if one thinks that one, as Prime Minister, has the ability to do what one wants, to push through laws and take the country in a specific direction, then there is the check system in the United Kingdom that can stop that, and that is exactly what we have seen swing into action today, and what we've seen swinging into action over the past few weeks in a bid to stop Boris Johnson from doing exactly what he wants. All eyes now on the British Prime Minister to see how he is going to react following the ruling today. He said he's going to adhere to it, but at the same time he said that he is not going to resign.
Indeed, we'll be following this story very closely indeed here on France 24. Philip Tell from my International Affairs Desk. Thank you. This year's United Nations General Assembly kicks off today in New York, but world leaders have already been holding talks on the sidelines of the gathering. On Monday, Britain, France and Germany issuing a joint statement backing the United States and blaming Iran for a recent attack on Saudi oil sites. French President Emmanuel Macron has offered to mediate between Tehran and Washington as tensions between the two reach fever pitch, an offer that was quickly rebuffed by the US President, as Alexander Orcott explains.
At a time of extreme tensions, the French president offered to hold talks with his Iranian counterpart ahead of the United Nations General Assembly. This is France, Britain and Germany all joined the US in saying there's no plausible explanation other than Iran being responsible for the attack on Saudi oil fields 10 days ago. The European powers are still trying to get Iran to stick to the terms of the 2015 nuclear deal that the US withdrew from last year, whilst Emmanuel Macron has offered to act as mediator with Washington. But the self-professed deal-maker Donald Trump says he needs no help with negotiations.
We don't need a mediator. Iran wants to do something, and I don't think we need a mediator. He's a friend of mine, but we're not looking for any mediators. They know who to call.
The attacks on Saudi Arabia that cut the production of the world's biggest oil producer in half are threatening to dominate the UN General Assembly meeting this Tuesday. Iran's foreign minister earlier rubbished the idea that it was behind the attacks that are claimed by Yemen's Houthi rebels, saying it would be stupid to engage in such an activity, and that if it had, nothing would be left of the refinery.
This Tuesday, the French Parliament begins debating a bill that seeks to extend key fertility treatments to single women and lesbian couples. Currently, under French law, only straight couples have the right to access a number of procedures, including IVF. If approved, the move would bring France in line with a number of EU countries. But conservative groups decry a bill they say would deprive children of a father. Monty Francis has the story.
Lorraine Chanel is a French mother of two. Both of her children were born with the help of artificial insemination, but because she's a lesbian, she had to travel to Belgium to have the procedure.
I was already enduring a lot of stress when I began the endeavor. And to add to it, I had to go abroad. It went well, but being able to do it near where I live and being checked by my regular doctor would have been much, much easier.
It's also expensive. French women traveling to countries such as Spain and Belgium to receive medically assisted procreation, or PMA as it's known in France, can expect to spend thousands of dollars. Chesnel is raising her children with a female partner, but single women who want PMA are in the same situation. Now, a measure in a wide-sweeping bioethics bill could change that.
France is late when it comes to its legislation. The French people are ready, as they were for same-sex marriage a few years ago. The French people are ready, well ahead of their lawmakers, as with most things.
French President Emmanuel Macron made a campaign promise to legalize procedures such as artificial insemination and IVF for lesbians and single women. And it appears to be a move that most French people support. A recent poll found that 65% of the French public supports medically assisted procreation for single women, and 61% support it for lesbian couples. But conservative groups remain opposed. A group called La Manif pour tous, which led the fight against same-sex marriage, has organized a day of action for October 6th. If the measure passes, the French Health Ministry estimates it could double the demand for PMA and cost the government an additional 10 to 15 million euros a year. Chanel says her family and others have been paying a different kind of price for years.
It's psychologically difficult for our families. for our children who are able to understand what's happening.
She hopes a change in the law will afford rights she never had to future generations.
Well, that's all we have time for right now. Thank you very much for watching. There's more news coming up in about 15 minutes' time here on France 24. Do stay tuned.
France 24. Every art form.
Liberté, égalité, actualité. In 2014 and 2015, the Islamic State organization carried out a massacre of the Yazidi religious minority in Sinjar, northern Iraq. Considered heretics by the jihadists, they slaughtered the Yazidi men and kidnapped and carried off the women and children into slavery. To this day, many Yazidis remain unaccounted for. Some of the survivors are trying to rebuild their lives in Sinjar, but many are reluctant to return to the towns and villages where they were born and where their families died.
We revisit the deadly invasion of Sinjar by the Islamic State group, all this week on France 24.